like capitalism, the plantocracy, the intelligentsia, these different aspects of the Marxist theory of class and society, through which we often tend to look at the Caribbean, and which are very instrumental in the political identity and political formations in the Caribbean, especially in its movements towards independence. We covered that, we finished that, we are on to hybridization. Um, so, hybridization is one of the most crucial concepts to understand when you are thinking about the Caribbean. And as I've been talking about for the last few weeks, the Caribbean is about the different groups of people who have been here in the region in their different capacities, in their different numbers, with their different cultures, at their different times. And hybridization is the process by which a culture or society becomes a mixture of the cultures and societies of the various people who make it up. The main idea of this section is that creolization has shaped the Caribbean region through religion, food, language, and people. To understand creolization, the easiest way I think is through linguistics. So in linguistics, a creole is a language that develops when two groups of people who speak different languages have to develop a form of communication. Um, there's another phenomenon that is similar to this called a pidgin. But with a pidgin, Pidgin, I don't know if you'll need to know that word, but it's there. With a pidgin, the exchange of linguistic structure and linguistic ideas is sort of even, sort of evenly balanced, whereas a Creole has what we call a superstrate and a substrate. And the superstrate and the substrate refer to the language that is most heavily favored or biased toward the superstrate, and the language which is a lot less heavily favored, which is the substrate. And this usually happens because a Creole is a language that develops when people who speak different languages meet under some form of duress, where one group is in a position of hierarchical power or some sort of oppressive power over the other group. You get a Creole, which is what happens in the Caribbean a lot. Um, so that's one of the way. Again, we also talked about the fact that the word Creole in the context of Caribbean history also refers to people who are um, of they originate like ethnically, racially, culturally, historically outside of the Caribbean, but are born in and therefore native to the Caribbean. And the example that is usually used is African slaves who are born in the Caribbean. They're of African descent but born in the Caribbean. Those are Creole. But in this case, when we say Creole, we mean this mixture of whether it is religion, food, language, or people, this mixture of them, and usually mixture in conditions that are some sort of oppressive, where people are under duress. So, there are a few key terms in this module. We have plural society, and this is a big one. This is one of those ones that you could probably get a good essay out of. So a plural society, cultural institutions incompatible and not shared uh, between or among people of differing cultural and societal backgrounds, all living together in the same society. And so instead of a culture that is, you know, a naturalistically blended mix of culture A and culture B, you have a society in which exist multiple um, subcultures, sub societies, which are separate but simply coincident rather than actually mixed together. So, for example, this is not exactly an example of plural society, but this is just to demonstrate the point. In Trinidad, you have um, different religious groups: Muslims, Hindus, Roman Catholics. They all have their own schools. There are still children who are of these religions who attend public schools, but they have their own schools, and so that's the same concept that we're looking at when we talk about plural societies. These people are living in the same society, in the same culture, um, not the same culture, the same society, but their individual cultures and their individual subcultures and sub-societies, they don't mix, like oil and water. That's a plural society. A homogeneous society is a society in which all people share cultural institutions, whereas a heterogeneous society is a society in which different groups exist in their different institutions. So the idea of plural societies, which is a Caribbean social theory idea, is one of a heterogeneous society, but it's not entirely heterogeneous because again, um, of the inherent and prevalent, pervasive, asymmetric or unbalanced power structures that exist in Caribbean society. So, for example, while yes, the Muslims and the Hindus and the Roman Catholics in Trinidad may have their own schools that they send their children to, Muslims and Hindus may have their own shops, their own restaurants, and I mentioned those two specifically because the East Indian immigrants to the Caribbean were the ones who ended up working and buying and owning the land that they were here to work, which is different from how the other groups in the Caribbean um, came to became socialized and became part of the Caribbean societies that developed. And so they specifically are likely to have those specific economic institutions. Um, Also, of course, having their own educational institutions, that's a religious thing. Um, Having their own restaurants, that's a culinary thing. And so it's a plural society, and it's heterogeneous in that all these different cultural and religious groups live in separate institutions, but it's also partially homogeneous because the government, for example, is the well, it's different in Trinidad, but just this is a general Caribbean thing now. It's like in the days of colonialism, for example, even though these people might have been living separately in separate subcultures, voting was still voting in the Westminster system, in the first past the post system, for a parliamentary representative in a system of government that was European in nature and in origin. And so while they may have had their own educational institutions, their own economic sectors, their own cultures, their own institutions, the larger institution, the state in which they all have to participate, is still European. The taxes that they have to pay, the social services that they have to pay for, are still from the top down, and they are not split up into different subcultures. They have to be somewhat homogenous for the society to be one single society. Um, and similarly, the it's different in other islands of the Caribbean. Trinidad is extremely cosmopolitan, in Trinidad and Tobago, extremely cosmopolitan society. But in other Caribbean societies, um, you see, for example, Muslims, the way that they dress is heterogeneous with the way that the other um, people of Barbados might dress. And maybe some of them even speak Arabic. But they shop at the same supermarkets, at the same farmers markets, um, and they live in the same communities. They don't live in like separate um, communities that is just a large community of Muslims. They are like dispersed and integrated, but not fully, into the Barbadian society, like drops of oil in water. Because again, they are together, but they do not mix. That's a plural society and the difference between heterogeneous and homogeneous societies. We talked about acculturation already, which is the process in which one culture is absorbed into another, or the process of a people or a person or people um, kind of assimilating into a culture. There's also interculturation, which is the mutual exchange of cultural traits, eventually leading to the formation of new cultures. And again, we've talked about the situation of the Caribbean. It's very difficult for culture to be mutually exchanged in the Caribbean. It's very difficult for things to be equal in their nature because of the way the Caribbean is set up. But in other parts of the world and other cultures, you get you may have interculturation, which is a more equal, more mutual exchange. So, going back to the linguistics example, we have pigeons that have developed. The Philippines is a good example of a place where a pigeon may have developed. The Spanish colonial power over the Philippines, it was still quite severe, quite intense, but the cultural colonialism of the Spanish in the Philippines was not as completely overwhelming and destructive as it was in like with the British in the Caribbean, for example. And so a pidgin language could have developed as a result of genuine mutual exchange of linguistic traits between speakers of the European language and um, the indigenous language of the islands. Um, and so the mutual exchange of cultural traits eventually leads to the formation of a new culture because it's after a while you're going to have a new culture developing. We talked about the West Africans who were brought to the Caribbean and how a lot of them would have been Muslim in their, by name, they would have been Muslim. They would have had some contact with Arabic and they would have had some contact with the theology of Islam, but it was not pure halal of Islam like would have been practiced in Mecca. It was a syncretism of Islam with whatever religion they would have had in North or West Africa at the time. And that, you might say, is interculturation, more so than acculturation, which is what you might get in a place like the Caribbean, where when they were brought, they were forcefully stripped of whatever culture, whatever religious backgrounds they might have had. It didn't always work, but that was the intention. And the cultural background of the Europeans was forced onto them, and so it was a kind of forced acculturation rather than interculturation. One more key term, as we're talking about hybridization, we have various different words for people of mixed racial or ethnic makeup. So we have the Spanish word mestizo, which means mixed, and is a word that you might run into in various historical documents or just in general in any historical context where you have the Spanish Empire and you're looking at people of mixed heritage. You also have the various terms that were used in the British Empire. So you have mulatto, you have like a quartoon, a quintoon, an octoroon. There's a whole long list of them. And really, it was because the idea was that the white race was pure and the black race was an impurity or a corruption. They were essentially measuring how pure white someone was. And of course, they did it to perpetuate the system of colorism, which was a way of pitting people of African descent of varying skin tones, varying shades of light or dark skin tone, pitting them against each other so as to prevent them from collaborating, uniting, having solidarity with one another, and with and so to make revolution easier to manage and less organized and have smaller numbers if and when it did happen. And so there were quite a lot of terms, like I said, in the British Empire for these mixed people. But the main one that you want to pay attention to is mulatto. In the British Empire, you have mestizo, which is the Spanish term. You also have a term that I learned in school, but now I'm not 100% sure how politically correct it is, which is a dougla or dougla, depending on where you are from, how you pronounce it, which is the term for a person of mixed African and Indian descent. Um, and of course, again, Creole is also a term that is used to describe people of mixed um, descent, mixed heritage, mixed race. Key points. So we talked about the plural society as a Caribbean social theory, and the theorist responsible, or one of them at least, one of the major ones is a man named M.G. Smith, who used the thesis of the plural society to analyze the Caribbean region, considering the racial and cultural tensions which exist. A great example is Guyana, where the country is basically split into black and Indian, as it was described to me. There's black people and Indian people. You have the political parties, because they got their political voting system from the UK and they use the Westminster system and they use the first past the post voting model. They, like a lot of other places that use a Westminster system, have a two-party system at the moment. They just kind of fallen into two dominant parties, and there's not really a chance of any other party coming into power. And the way that it was explained to me, those two parties in Guyana are black and Indian. And so a lot of people vote simply on racial grounds rather than on policy grounds. And so considering these racial and cultural tensions that exist in the Caribbean, the plural society thesis was used by M.G. Smith to analyze the Caribbean region. The Creole society thesis has to do with the fact that under colonialism, Caribbean social structure was stratified on ascribed factors. And those are two terms that we're going to have to cover, but this Zoom meeting is about to end, so I will end it now and then restart the meeting immediately so you guys can join right back. Okay, so we'll get back to it. Yes. Um, so this idea of strata or stratification or a stratified society. Strata simply refers to levels. Um, and so if a society is stratified, it has various classes of people, and those classes have a hierarchical relationship because they're levels. They are strata in a stratified system. And so Caribbean social structure under colonialism was stratified based on ascribed factors. And an ascribed factor is a factor that, rather than being um, decided upon by the people or originated by the people who actually possess these factors, and the ascribed factors are factors that are applied to them by a separate group. So, yeah, the colorism that we just talked about is a great example of stratification on an ascribed factor, because Quartoons, who were people who had, I believe it was one white grandparent and three black grandparents, were seen as of a higher standing than like octoroons, which again I may not be remembering the maths correctly, but somebody who had like one white great grandparent and the other seven of their great grandparents were black. Um, and a mulatto would have been of higher standing than the two of them because one of their parents would have been white and one of them would have been black. And that's stratification based on an ascribed factor, the ascribed factor being this idea of um, the mixture of white and black, that a person is being an actual thing that you can use to measure or classify people. That's an ascribed factor. And so in Peru and Creole societies, some cultural practices are lost, some are retained, still practiced, and some are reintroduced. And so we have these three terms here: cultural erasure, cultural retention, and cultural renewal, which are some of the most important terms to remember for your multiple choice, because almost every year there is a question about erasure, about the difference between cultural retention and cultural renewal. They'll give you an example of something and they'll ask, is this cultural retention or is this cultural renewal? And people will have a lot of trouble deciphering which one it is, and there'll be a lot of discussion about it. So it's important to understand these terms. Cultural retention is the keeping of specific practices, and cultural renewal is bringing back of cultural practices that were not practiced for a while. Good example of cultural retention is Barbados' national dish. Barbados' national dish is cuckoo and flying fish. And this cuckoo is, in origin, a West African dish. It's not some like attempt by some cultural group to, let's find a West African dish and, you know, get back to our roots, get back to our heritage. Um, it's just something that was preserved through the culture of the kitchen, the culture of food, culinary culture, by the people of West African descent in Barbados during the period of slavery and colonialism, and it having been, not necessarily a staple of Barbadian culture, because the agricultural economy of Barbados would not really have been structured for people to eat. It was structured for the British to make money. But it being, um, it having the place that it had in the culinary culture of Barbados, and it having survived as long as it had, and having been passed down. And it's not exactly the same as it is in West Africa. I mean, it's not the same as it is in our neighboring Caribbean islands, who are about an hour away by plane. When you say cuckoo in Barbados, there's a dish in Trinidad called cuckoo. It's made of the same stuff, but it's a different dish and it's eaten differently. It's presented differently. There are different culinary methods that are used to make it and to prepare it. So yeah, it's not exactly the same, but it is an aspect of the West African culture of the people who were brought that survived. Whereas the playing of traditional West African drums. Drumming is very, 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 has always been very, very important to African people, and the specific kind of drum that was played in West Africa by the people who would have been brought um, from from West Africa to the Caribbean was outlawed by the British because it was an aspect of culture. And if people practice their culture, they will feel human, they will feel empowered, they will have solidarity, they will have communication, they will have civilization. And the whole aim of the British was to strip these people of all of that stuff. Because if they have any of that, then the mission to exploit them is undermined. So the British made it illegal. And so there's a little bit of both retention and renewal in the way that the drum um, was treated and the history of the drum in the Caribbean. It's, I'm sure it's different in every Caribbean island, and I'm sure the history of the drum in every Caribbean island is quite interesting. If that is something that you think you might want to write an essay on, if it interests you enough, I say go look it up. Go ask some historians. You should be able to find some resources on the internet or in your school library or in a local library near you about the history of the drum in your Caribbean island or territory or in all of the Caribbean islands wherever you can find them. Um, but yeah, it's a little bit of retention because while the drum was outlawed and technically illegal, it was also the practice of playing the drum and these storytelling practices of the West Africans were kept alive, in secret at night. They had covert sessions where they would still practice their culture. Um, but because it was outlawed, um, it was it was a great effort by the authorities to stamp out the existence and cultural presence of the West African drums in the Caribbean. And that was eventually undone when those laws, went off the books a lot more recently than you might think. The history of the Caribbean is very dark and surprising. And so those laws came off the books much more recently than you might think. And so that was from the legal aspect, it's now legal again. But because it's not just a legal matter, it's a cultural thing. That culture had to be renewed, revived. And so, through the work of certain Pan Africanists, certain activists, there was work done to renew that aspect of the culture of the playing of the drums. And yeah, that's, I think the African drum is quite a good example of both cultural retention and cultural renewal. But I think it's largely, at least in its modern incarnation, the product of cultural renewal. Um, the way that the African drums are played and the place that they have in modern Caribbean culture and society. Okay, next key point, the impact of technology on culture of the Caribbean region is, of course, positive and negative. And when I say technology, I don't just mean smartphones and laptops and the radio and the television. Almost anything is technology. Windmills are technology. The treadmill, which is nowadays a workout device, but back in the day when it was invented, was a method that turned the kinetic energy produced by walking into a process for processing sugarcane. So, like a windmill or just any sort of mill, a mill is just a place where things are processed and products are made. You go from raw materials to more refined products. A treadmill was a similar thing. Instead of using the kinetic energy of animals walking, they used the energy of people walking, and it was like a set of stairs that would move, and that's how the treadmill originally started. And the point is, that is a technology. The still houses that were used to turn sugar cane into sugar and molasses, that's technology. Um, and technology has a massive impact on the culture of the region, in both, again, positive and negative ways. So, one of the, you could call it positive impacts of, for example, the Industrial Revolution was the impact that the Industrial Revolution had on slavery. So, as we know, slavery, when it was ended for a multitude of reasons, and the battle was won on a multitude of fronts. But the biggest reason that slavery was ended was not, an encouraging, hopeful, humanitarian, um, morally just reason. It was just about money. It was about the economy, and it was about how expensive it is to use human labor, no matter how dehumanized humans are, no matter how poorly you treat them, no matter how cheap their living conditions are, no matter how you don't have to pay them at all if they're slaves, um, it was still becoming cheaper and cheaper to produce the products that were done by slave labor mechanically, and so there was a lot more machinery and automation being used to do those jobs. And so the Industrial Revolution did a number on the economic validity of continuing the slave trade. And so, for that reason, along with the others, the Society for the Effecting of the Abolition of the Slave Trade, of course, with those abolitionists that you may hear about, William Wilberforce, um, Gustavo Equiano, or Olaudah Equiano. They helped, they were a part of the fight, but the main reason was the economic reason that the Industrial Revolution made the production of the things that slave labor was used for cheaper if you used machines rather than slave labor. Um, and so that is the impact of that technology on the Caribbean. It had an economic impact, it had a legal impact, but of course, there's also a cultural impact because there is a certain class of people who can actually use the technology and benefit from the technology of the Industrial Revolution. And there's another class of people who, not having the social status or the generational wealth or the political bargaining power to be able to participate in the Industrial Revolution, were stuck in the more manual ways of doing things that the Industrial Revolution made redundant for, again, a certain class of people who actually had access to that kind of technology. And so you can look at the Industrial Revolution and the impact on on the culture of the Caribbean. The people who had access to the means to participate in that revolution, the Industrial Revolution, became a different kind of culture, became a different kind of people from the others who did not. And similarly with the sugar revolution, um, much earlier on in the days of slavery. So slave labor was not originally used to produce sugar and to farm sugarcane and produce sugar, but when eventually sugarcane was introduced to the region, um, its profitability, its efficiency agriculturally, a lot of things drove it to become the dominant cash crop of the region, and the technologies used to farm sugarcane became much more prevalent, and The technological innovation was directed at maximizing the efficiency of the production of the processing of sugarcane and the production of its byproducts. And again, that is a big technological revolution that had an impact on the culture of the region because it went from a relatively, not quite ecologically sound because these are European colonists. They don't really care about the ecology of the places they're colonizing, but a more biodiverse way of doing things to a monocrop and monocultured way of keeping these Caribbean islands that itself had an impact on the culture of the region. Because now what's what the majority of the resources of the region were being poured into was not about, it had nothing to do with feeding people because it was a monoculture cash crop rather than, like for example, nowadays in the US or in various parts of the Americas, corn or maize is itself like the new monoculture. In a lot of places, the new monocrop. But corn, you know, is a food crop. It's not just a cash crop that is used, for example, to produce sugar and molasses and rum. And so even like those two, comparing those two monocrops, sugarcane and maize, you have different cultural impacts of the technology of farming those two crops. Okay? I think we are just about done with culture and society. We're moving on to, well, for now at least, we'll get back to it. But right now, we have to take a break and look at some geography. So before we do that, any questions on any of the aspects of culture and society that we've covered so far? Okay, great. Then we'll move right along to the impact of geographical phenomena. This is a short aspect of the syllabus. We won't spend too much time on it. We'll get right through it, and we'll get back to all the complicated sociological stuff. But it is still important to go through it. So, when we look at geographical phenomena, we're looking at natural hazards and natural disasters. That's basically what this module is, this section of the syllabus is about. It's about earthquakes and volcanoes, their implications for Caribbean economies and how they affect Caribbean culture, the details of the disasters that have occurred in the region, and the preventative methods that mitigate the impact of these disasters. So we have an earthquake, which is tectonic plates moving. Whenever tectonic plates move, so the tectonic plates are just like pieces of the Earth's crust that make geological formations, and when they move, you get earthquakes. There are different ways in which they move. You have various kinds of boundaries. I'm not a geography student. I'm not exactly a geologist. So I know there's like a transform boundary and there are other kinds of boundaries, but I'm not sure of all the specifics of them. But the point is, tectonic plates move, you get earthquakes. When earthquakes happen underwater, they move a bunch of water, and that water is a tsunami. And when and there's also volcanoes, which are also tectonic or seismic in nature, which are, you know, there's rock that makes up the Earth's crust, and as you go further down, there there's like hotter and hotter rock, and some of the rock is so hot that it is melted and it is in liquid form, and that's magma when it's underground and lava when it's above ground, and the movement of tectonic plates again is responsible for what the phenomenon that we call a volcano, where that magma moves above ground and you get a volcano. It's not always an eruption, but it's always a volcano. Before we go on, I saw that you left and came back. Do you have any questions about the culture and society parts that we covered before we get right into geographical phenomena? Okay, so geographical phenomena. Yes. Earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, various manifestations of the same phenomenon. The Caribbean is geologically complex and has unique seismic activity. Plate boundaries can be convergent, divergent, and transform. There it is. That's the thing. Earthquakes are the result of seismic activity where the plates come into contact. Volcanoes are found at cracks between tectonic plates, or in tectonic plates. Tsunamis can be caused when an earthquake or volcanic eruption occurs at sea. The impact of earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis may be economic, political, social, and environmental. Um, so yeah, we know what earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis are. We know the Caribbean region. I don't know if we did cover this in detail in the first class, but the Caribbean region is an archipelago situated on top of a tectonic plate that is basically the size and shape of the Caribbean um, basin, the whole region that is surrounded by those like Central and South American countries and the Caribbean archipelago. Yeah, the plate is basically like right underneath the Caribbean Sea, and because of that, the Caribbean region being on its own tectonic plate, um, we don't have what you might call like a like there are places, for example, in North America where you have two tectonic plates and their boundary is over land in places where people live. And so their earthquake risk is different from ours. Ours is that we have this one tectonic plate where all of our land is situated within the tectonic plate, but because we have so much water around, um, and there are plate boundaries on all sides, the Caribbean plate is incident on, I don't remember exactly, but there's quite a few plates. I think it's like 5 different tectonic plates that the Caribbean plate is incident on, but you can Google that yourself. That's not particularly a big deal. The point is, we have a lot of tectonic activity around us, and because it happens um, underwater, because it's either the Atlantic Ocean or in the Caribbean Sea itself, that we will get the effects of seismic activity occurring incident on the Caribbean plate. Um, we have a unique risk here for seismic activity. All of the islands of the Caribbean, with the exception of Barbados, are volcanic in nature, whether the volcano is active or not, whether it is a volcano that erupts with like lava or with mud. All the Caribbean islands except Barbados are, in fact, volcanic, and so that is a unique risk. Um, you may have heard of Jenny, which is the nickname that we give to this one particular volcano. Um, that is, theorized. It's like commonly thought that if this volcano or if these series of seismic events that would cause this volcano to erupt occur, then the chain reaction, the knock-on effect that it would have for the seismic activity in the rest of the Caribbean region would be devastating. But that's another unique risk for geological phenomena, geographical phenomena in the Caribbean region. So, one of the major things that we have to focus on in this part of the syllabus is the terms natural hazard and natural disaster. It's a simple enough concept to understand. A natural hazard is any situation that has the potential to harm or destroy human beings or damage or livestock or damage or destroy infrastructure. So the fact that we have lots of volcanoes in the Caribbean region and most of them are not dormant or extinct, or most of them are not extinct. Some of them are dormant and a few of them might still be active, but that's a natural hazard. And when one of them, like Mont Soufriere last year, erupts, that's a natural disaster. The fact that most of the Caribbean is right in the path of hurricanes that originate off the coast of West Africa, travel across the Atlantic Ocean, and smash into the Americas, is a natural hazard, when one of those hurricanes actually comes, it's a natural disaster. The fact that we are situated on a tectonic plate that is incident on about five other plates is a natural hazard. When that actually results in an earthquake, that's a natural disaster. A natural disaster is the realization or manifestation of a natural hazard. I think that makes sense. So there's that, and then there's also, of course, hurricanes, the big one. Hurricanes are prevalent in the Caribbean between July and December. You know, because of climate change, the hurricane season is expected to shift over time, and we're already seeing some of the effects of that, where we have hurricane season lasting slightly longer. And we tend to say that the hurricane season ends like on the last day of November, but well, we say hurricane season or rainy season, but that we tend to say that that season ends on the 30th of November. But the last few years, we've seen rainy season going into December, and because of the effects of climate change, we expect that to continue to shift. The impact of hurricanes is extensive and is accompanied by, the thing. It's high winds, lots of rain, flooding, um, telephone poles are knocked down, people's houses are flooded out, and so on. You get a lot of soil erosion, of course, and the causes of soil erosion are both man-made and natural. So soil erosion can be the result of a number of things. One can be poor infrastructure. What you build in the soil, or what you put in the soil, or what you do with the soil, has an impact on how it erodes. Also, what you plant in the soil. So I'm sure there's been quite a lot of ecological damage done to the Caribbean as a result of the history of the sugar monocrop, and I'm sure some environmental sciences student could tell me about just what impact the singular and like totalitarian reign of sugar in the Caribbean, or sugarcane in the Caribbean islands, had on the soil quality, and the implications that that has had for modern soil erosion. But yeah, that's soil erosion. That's also another big natural hazard that becomes, um, maybe not a disaster, but certainly a problem in a lot of areas over time. Conservation techniques are, of course, key to mitigating the impacts of a natural disaster. And, all the hurricane preparedness tips that you get every year, um, you you get like advice on, here's what to do if there's a tsunami, here are the warning signs, how to identify tsunami, and where you have to go, what you have to do, and so on and so forth. And again, these have an impact on the way that the culture and society of the Caribbean are set up. So the Caribbean has hurricane shelters all over the place. Not everywhere in the world has hurricane shelters, because not everywhere in the world has a yearly 6-month hurricane season. We have hurricane shelters. Lots of windows, lots of people's houses have hurricane shelters on the windows. People will board up their houses, um, and board up their windows, for example. And, the way that Caribbean culture and society is influenced by the hurricane season is quite interesting. And as we talked about before, one of the factors that pushed the original Caribbean people away from the island that is now known as Barbados, but to them was known as Ichiruganai, was um, the so at least it's theorized by historians and anthropologists that it was hurricane damage, and the effects of a hurricane that led to a lot of destruction and flooding. Barbados is quite flat, because it's not volcanic. There's not really a lot of mountainous terrain. The soil is, of course, a different kind of soil than in the rest of the Caribbean islands, because again, it's not volcanic, it's limestone. And so, yeah, the impact that hurricanes and the prevalence of hurricanes has on life in the Caribbean is, of course, quite interesting. And finally, we have coral reefs, drought, and disaster preparedness. So coral reefs serve many purposes, but are facing extinction due to many factors. Coral reefs, so coral polyps are tiny soft-bodied organisms related to sea anemones and jellyfish. Um, at their base is a hard, protective limestone skeleton um, called, is that acolyte? Um, okay, I'll have to look that up. But yeah, basically, what coral is these polyps, these tiny soft-bodied organisms. When they die, they fall to the seafloor, and because of what they are made of, their corpses become coral. And of course, it takes lots of different, brilliant and unique shapes and colors and sizes. And coral reefs uh, have are wonderful, and they act as um, like storm surge barriers. They reduce the severity of tides, tidal waves. They can act as breaks for tsunamis because, of course, if you have a lot of water moving above the surface, you have to have a lot of water moving below the surface to move that water. And when you have a coral reef in the way, it slows down and, kind of like mellows out that water, which is why places that have a lot of coral reefs, they tend to be quite calm. The water tends to be quite calm, and places that don't, the water tends to be quite rough. And of course, coral reefs are facing extinction due to many things. So lots of harvesting of coral reefs for like tourism purposes, people just going down and diving and picking up corals, but also because of pollution, coral reefs being bleached due to chemical or mechanical processes. The Great Barrier Reef, for example, um, is the famous example that you may have heard of a coral reef taking some serious damage that it hasn't really recovered from. But you know, there is good news in that field if you are interested in that. Um, so coral grows in warm, clear, oxygenated water between 20 and 27 degrees Celsius, um, less than 45 meters deep, with warm ocean currents and normal salinity. Um, I'm not sure how important all of that will be, but again, if you want to do a deep dive on corals and coral reefs, you can of course look more into that because that's what this Caribbean study syllabus is all about. Find a topic or two that like really interest you, and you go quite deep into those and prepare for just in case you have to write an essay on a particular topic. You have a good breadth of knowledge. You're well read about a particular topic, and you can do it justice. Um, let's see. Droughts. So economies and countries may need to um, import more food than they export, and the import bill increases. Limited food hikes up prices, so you get lots of inflation when a drought occurs. Um, and there are, of course, so that's the economic um, impacts of a drought. The social impacts of a drought are water shortages leading to mental and physical stress. Um, you know, Production is reduced and firms may lay off staff, resulting in an increase in poverty and crime, a decrease in productivity, and once again leading to inflation because of the necessity of having an abundance of water for society to function. And of course, we have kind of the other side of the coin from drought, which is flooding and the impacts of flooding on societies. So the economic impact is, of course, the widespread destruction of plants and machinery. When I say plants, I mean manufacturing plants and machinery may cause production to cease and businesses to close. And again, unemployment increases. Communities, this is the social impact. Communities, of course, are going to be destroyed. Human lives lost, families split up, the infrastructure of communities damaged. Roads become impassable and people get stuck where they are. Um, and so, yeah, flooding is also quite a serious thing
And of course, there are places like um, Guyana that have lots of quite mighty rivers, and so their relationship with flooding is different from a place like Barbados, which doesn't really have much of that, but does get hit um, by the first of the tropical systems, the tropical cyclone systems, whether they are tropical waves, depressions, storms, or full-blown hurricanes. And so the relationship with flooding is, of course, going to be different in places like Barbados than it is in places like Guyana. Disaster preparedness. We talked about that already. You know, you get hurricane tips every year, you get tsunami advice. Measures can be enforced to reduce the effects of natural disasters on the region. So they avoid building in places prone to hurricanes or floodings. They have to make buildings stronger and more durable by enforcing building codes, and you can look those up. Those are quite interesting. They encourage relocation away from known disaster-prone areas, like in Montserrat, where the majority of the island had to be abandoned due to the volcano, and they make sure that supplies are readily available, such as batteries, canned food, potable water, and first aid kits, in the event that, you know, society or community takes a serious hit as a result of one of these natural disasters. If there are any questions, I'll take those. If not, that's the end of geographical phenomena. And next week we will get on to the impact of societal institutions on Caribbean people. And this is quite an interesting one, but it's quite heavy and sociological. So come prepared to take notes. Any questions? Okay, well, thank you all for